So when you press the power button on your phone, you kind of just expect instant magic, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. You just touch the glass and boom.
Exactly. The screen lights up, and literally the entire sum of human knowledge is just, sitting right there in the palm of your hand.
It's incredible when you really think about it.
It is. But you certainly don't expect that screen-like, that massive localized triumph of engineering to be entirely dependent on the fate of a single oil tanker.
Right. A tanker that's just, navigating a war zone halfway across the globe.
Yeah, it sounds crazy. But that's exactly what we're looking at today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
So today's mission, we are unpacking a really brief but incredibly dense piece of geopolitical commentary.
And we should probably mention right up front, this text is highly attenuated.
Oh, absolutely. I want to be entirely clear with you listening right now. The text we're deep diving into is politically charged. It deals directly with U.S. policy, the Trump administration, and some major ongoing global conflicts.
Yeah, and to be clear, we are not here to take a side.
Right, exactly. We're not endorsing these views or, validating the politics of the author. Our sole job today is to impartially map out the underlying logic of the argument.
We basically want to trace the cause and effect relationships the author presents, so you, the listener, can evaluate the architecture of the argument for yourself.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. What is the inciting incident here?
Well, the foundation of the author's argument starts with a very specific critique of U.S. foreign policy. They claim that the U.S. has basically adopted this whack-a-mole strategy with Iranian leadership.
A whack-a-mole strategy. What exactly do they mean by that?
Like, instead of a cohesive, long-term stabilizing doctrine, they describe this pattern of really unpredictable pressure. So sudden sanctions, targeted military or political strikes.
Rapid tactical shifts.
Right, just popping up and hitting whatever problem presents itself, hence the whack-a-mole analogy.
Which, inherently creates this environment where global markets just cannot accurately price in risk.
Oh, exactly. When your strategy relies on sporadic, unpredictable escalations, global trade is just kept in a perpetual state of anxiety.
Right. And the author argues this isn't just a localized, diplomatic issue in the Middle East. They make this explosive claim that this exact strategy has effectively blown up the world's energy supply chains.
Yeah, that phrase blew up the world's energy supply chains. That is really the linchpin of this entire piece.
It's a huge claim.
It is. And the author spends the whole first section methodically tearing down this really common domestic narrative in the United States.
You mean the idea that, the U.S. produces its own oil, so we're insulated?
Exactly. The sentiment goes, hey, the U.S. produces massive amounts of oil and natural gas. We are officially energy independent. Therefore, whatever chaos happens in the Middle East,
The U.S. economy is fundamentally totally fine.
right. The author aggressively attacks that U.S. is fine mentality.
Because they argue that domestic energy independence is really just an illusion of security.
Right. Yeah, because having energy is only relevant if you actually manufacture the goods that power your economy.
And the text points out that almost nothing critical to our digital infrastructure is actually made in America yet.
No, not at all. The focus shifts entirely to our manufacturing dependencies in Asia. The author actually lists out these specific, completely irreplaceable nodes in the tech supply chain.
And the U.S. completely relies on its partners for these.
Completely. We're talking about upstream precursors, advanced semiconductors, rare earths, and the foundries themselves.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Let's look at the actual mechanics of what those dependencies mean in the physical world.
Sure.
So when the author talks about upstream precursors, we're dealing with these highly specialized chemical building blocks, right?
Yeah, like industrial gases and solvents.
But engineered to microscopic purities, like
Yeah.
stuff that is required just to prep a silicon wafer before you can even do anything with it.
Exactly. And then you have rare earths.
Right, the specialized minerals. You need them for the magnets in electric vehicle motors, the phosphors in the screens we were talking about earlier.
And then, of course, there are the foundries. And it is so crucial to understand that a modern semiconductor foundry is, arguably the most complex manufacturing environment ever created by human beings.
Oh, absolutely. There are multi-billion-dollar facilities.
Running extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. I mean, they are printing circuits at literally the atomic level.
Which requires an insanely clean environment.
Yeah, a hyper clean environment where, a single particle of dust can just ruin millions of barrels of product instantly.
So the author lists the specific partners the U.S. relies on to operate these facilities. Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, Korea.
Right. They hold the actual physical infrastructure.
So the way I'm thinking about this, it's almost like running a bakery.
Okay, a bakery. Let's hear it.
Well, think about it. The U.S. might have plenty of flour, right? We have the IP, we have our domestic oil. But if our partners in Asia hold all the eggs and the sugar and the ovens.
Yeah. Ah, I see where you're going.
Right. And if their power gets cut off because of some massive energy crisis, the U.S. still doesn't get a cake.
That's actually a really great analogy. The U.S. has the brilliant blueprints, but our partners have the hyper-specialized physical capacity.
But wait, I have to jump in and push back on this premise a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
Because it feels like a logical leap in the author's argument. Like, okay, the U.S. is doing this volatile whack-a-mole strategy in the Middle East. Why does that instantly cripple the tech sector in Asia?
Well,
I mean, Japan is a highly developed nation. Taiwan has been investing heavily in renewables. Are these Asian tech hubs really so brittle that a skirmish over oil in the Middle East just shuts down a multi-billion-dollar foundry?
they absolutely are, and it really comes down to the unforgiving physics of baseload power generation.
Baseload power.
Yeah. A semiconductor foundry doesn't just need electricity. It needs a staggering, totally uninterrupted volume of electricity to maintain perfect climate control and run those lasers 24/7.
Right, a flicker in the grid and a whole batch of chips is ruined.
Exactly. Now, look at the geography of the partners the author listed. Japan, Taiwan, Korea.
Oh, they're island nations?
Island nations or peninsulas. They are almost completely devoid of the natural resources required to generate that level of baseload power domestically.
Ah, okay. Because post-Fukushima, Japan leaned heavily away from nuclear power, right?
Yes. And they moved heavily into imported liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
And Taiwan, I think they import something like, what is it, 97% of their total energy?
Precisely. They rely overwhelmingly on oil and LNG shipped directly from the Middle East.
Wow.
So when the U.S. engages in these unpredictable tactical strikes against Iranian leadership, it doesn't even take a physical blockade to cause a huge crisis.
It's just a threat.
Right. The mere threat of an escalating conflict causes maritime insurance premiums for tankers navigating those waters to just skyrocket overnight.
Oh, right. Because insurers are like, we are not covering a ship sailing into a war zone.
Yeah.
Exactly. Tankers get delayed, shipping lanes are completely rerouted, and the cost of the raw energy required to run those Asian foundries just shoots through the roof.
So the foundries face this massive margin squeeze. Or worse, the threat of rolling blackouts. I mean, you can't operate a hypersensitive atomic clean room if the local grid is rationing electricity.
Not at all, because the LNG shipments are, stuck in a geopolitical standoff.
So tying this back, the author's point is that the U.S. economy is utterly dependent on Asian factories.
Yep.
And those Asian factories are utterly dependent on Middle Eastern energy.
Exactly. Therefore, the whole U.S. is fine narrative just completely collapses.
You cannot decouple our domestic economic security from the energy security of our manufacturing partners.
You really can't.
Which means, if we follow this logic, this U.S. strategy actively sabotages the very supply chains we rely on to build our own technology.
Yeah, it creates enormous economic pain for the U.S. and its allies.
Which naturally forces a really crucial question. If the architects of this policy and our allies are the losers in this scenario, who is actually cashing in? Who benefits from the volatility?
Well, the text pivots right here to outline the unintended geopolitical winners. And the author makes a very blunt, very controversial assertion.
Okay, let's hear it.
They argue that the clear beneficiaries of this disruption are Russia and Israel.
Wow.
Yeah. The text goes so far as to accuse the U.S. of screwing over its Asian allies, specifically to help these two nations.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that. Why does the author think Russia benefits? I mean, obviously they sell oil, the price of oil goes up, they make more money. But it's more complex than that, right?
It is. It's entirely about structural geopolitical leverage.
Right.
You see, oil is priced at the margins.
Right.
So a small disruption in global supply doesn't just cause a small increase in price, it causes total panic buying.
Which spikes the price exponentially.
Exactly. Now, Russia is a massive exporter of energy. They have vast pipeline networks, they have a shadow fleet of tankers.
So when the Middle East is destabilized by U.S. policy?
Global buyers scramble for secure baseload power. Russia doesn't just get a massive influx of cash. It gains this captive audience of nations.
Nations that were so desperate for energy, they're forced to overlook Russia's other geopolitical transgressions.
Exactly. By creating scarcity, the author argues the U.S. is basically handing Russia an economic weapon to wield against the rest of the world.
Okay, that makes sense from the author's perspective. And what about Israel?
Regarding Israel, the author implies the U.S. is prioritizing localized regional security objectives over the existential needs of its own global supply chain.
So, an unpredictable, hardline stance against Iranian leadership aligns perfectly with Israel's immediate deterrence strategy.
Right. And the author contends the U.S. is perfectly willing to absorb massive global economic collateral damage like starving its Asian tech partners of affordable energy just to facilitate that localized objective for Israel.
Okay, I follow the mechanism the author is laying out there. Regardless of whether someone agrees with the underlying politics, you can see the logic. But this brings us to the part of the text that really stopped me in my tracks.
Let me guess. Iran.
Yes, Iran. The author claims that Iran, who is the exact target of this U.S. whack-a-mole strategy, actually emerges as a long-term winner.
It sounds totally counterintuitive.
Right. If the stated goal of U.S. policy is to suppress and isolate Iranian leadership, how on earth does the author justify the claim that Iran comes out ahead?
Well, it requires looking at the second-order effects of isolation.
Okay.
The text argues that this intense, unpredictable pressure doesn't actually force Iran into submission. Instead, it forces them into a structural pivot toward the east. The author explicitly notes that Iran can simply, quote, use China to rebuild infrastructure.
So by trying to lock Iran out of the Western economic system, the U.S. inadvertently just serves them up on a silver platter to Beijing.
Pretty much. Think about China. They have immense capital reserves, elite engineering capabilities, and this unquenchable thirst for secured energy sources.
And they're actively looking for footholds in the Middle East for their Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. The author is suggesting that U.S. pressure just accelerates this long-term structural partnership between a major global rival and a resource-rich nation.
So China gets a strategic anchor in the Middle East, and Iran gets a powerful patron who is largely immune to Western sanctions, so they can rebuild their domestic infrastructure.
It's a win-win for them. But there's more. The text also argues Iran gets richer through oil and what the author calls tariffs on the Strait.
Okay, let's be super clear about the geography here for everyone listening. They are talking about the Strait of Hormuz,
Right, a waterway that is only like 21 miles wide at its narrowest point.
which is insane because a massive percentage of the world's globally traded oil passes right through it.
Yep. So when the author says Iran gets richer from tariffs, they don't mean literal customs duties.
Right, they mean a geopolitical tax.
Exactly. Because of their geographic position, Iranian leadership can exert immense asymmetrical pressure on that choke point.
They don't even need a massive conventional navy to blockade the strait, do they?
No, not at all. They just need fast attack craft, drones, sea mines to harass commercial shipping.
And the mere capability to disrupt traffic acts as a tariff on the entire global economy.
Exactly. It drives up the cost of oil everywhere, which makes whatever oil Iran does manage to sell on the gray market exponentially more valuable.
It grants them incredible leverage.
Oh, immense leverage.
Okay, let me try to summarize the chessboard here as the author sees it, because it is just a devastating critique.
Go for it.
The text argues that the U.S. strategy against Iranian leadership accidentally spikes global energy prices, which directly funds Russian ambitions.
Right.
It pushes Iran into a long-term infrastructure and security alliance with China.
Yep.
It hands Iran asymmetrical leverage over the world's most critical shipping lane. And in doing all of this, it starves America's own tech partners in Asia of the energy they require to manufacture the critical hardware the U.S. economy literally runs on.
The author views it as an absolute masterclass in strategic self-sabotage.
Wow. Which means we really have to examine the author's proposed alternative. Because they don't just complain, right? They move from diagnosing the failure to arguing what a self-interested protective national policy should actually look like.
Right. They make a direct plea to redefine the core concept of the America First doctrine.
So, traditionally, political rhetoric around America First has been framed as a turning inward.
Yeah, a very localized view of national security. It focuses heavily on domestic borders, pumping domestic energy, bringing blue-collar factory jobs back to the mainland.
But the author introduces what they call a harsh reality.
And that reality is that a true America First policy must inherently include securing America's global supply chains.
Because you cannot just blow up the rest of the world's energy trade. Watch your manufacturing partners grind to a complete halt and then proudly claim the U.S. is fine just because we have our own oil.
Exactly. The defining characteristic of a 21st century economy is that your borders extend to wherever your critical components are manufactured.
So national security is no longer just about guarding your physical coastline.
No, it's about actively managing and protecting the incredibly complex, fragile web of global trade that allows your modern digital economy to function at all.
It requires a massive shift in how we even conceptualize defense. Like if we think of national security like modern enterprise cybersecurity.
Okay, I like this.
The traditional America First doctrine is kind of like building the world's most impenetrable firewall around your corporate headquarters, right? You have armed guards at the door, your local servers are locked down, you feel incredibly secure inside the building.
But your critical data isn't actually stored in that building.
Exactly. Your data, the advanced semiconductors, the rare earths, is hosted on servers halfway across the world.
And those servers are sitting in a flood zone with a leaky roof and no backup generator.
Yes. The author is basically arguing that your impenetrable local firewall is entirely useless if you don't secure the distant nodes of your network. Your security posture absolutely must extend to the most vulnerable link in your supply chain.
It is a really profound realization about geopolitical interconnectedness.
It really is.
You literally cannot separate domestic economic stability from global supply chain security. They are the exact same thing now.
So, considering how scathing this critique is, I was actually surprised by the ending of the piece.
Yeah, the tone shifts, right?
It does. After laying out this massive structural vulnerability, they don't end on a note of absolute despair. They end with a warning that is, strangely, kind of optimistic.
The final words are literally a plea. It's still not too late.
Which is an urgent call for a reality check.
Exactly. The author is demanding that policymakers recognize this deep integration before the damage to our technological infrastructure becomes irreversible.
They want leaders to stop treating global diplomacy as just a series of isolated tactical strikes.
And start treating it like the delicate, interdependent ecosystem it actually is. Because if you destabilize the baseline of that ecosystem, which is the flow of energy, the entire superstructure just collapses.
This text really forces a major shift in perspective.
Yeah.
For you listening right now, whether you completely reject the author's politics, whether you fiercely disagree with their assessment of the Trump administration or Israel or Russia, the hardware reality they outline is just undeniable.
Completely undeniable. The modern world operates on an absolute razor's edge of logistics.
An energy dispute in one hemisphere can instantly dictate the availability, the cost, and the literal physical production of the silicon chips that power your daily life.
I mean, the device you're using to listen to us right now exists solely because of a fragile global equilibrium.
An equilibrium that allows energy to flow to the exact facilities that require it.
And that reality introduces a really vital question about the future of global conflict, something to really think about. Oh, absolutely, because we've spent this entire deep dive analyzing how disruptions in raw energy transit cripple the semiconductor supply chain, right?
Right. But if a single geographically distant choke point can entirely freeze the creation of the world's technology, the nature of geopolitical leverage is evolving.
Which brings up a terrifying thought. How long until major world powers start fighting over the raw energy itself?
And instead begin fighting over the physical shipping routes of the finished technology.